So welcome to the webinar. It's going to be a good one today. It's of course going to all be about weather in NEC contracts and asking this kind of very, very broad question: is it fair or is it flawed? And I don't know if we're going to have an answer about it today. Me and Glenn have slightly differing views on this. So excited to talk with you all about this today. I'll just quickly introduce myself. So I'm Josh Graham. I'm the founder of EHAB. For those of you who don't know, we are a weather intelligence company helping construction companies to make better decisions around weather and schedules. Glenn?
Welcome everyone. I'm Glenn Hyde. I run a company called GMH Planning. Some of you know of us, and we're a specialist consultancy that focuses on NEC forms of contracts. That's all we do. We're providing support to the industry. Anyone using NEC forms of contract, we're training, supporting, and the founder of the NEC People LinkedIn group, there's several of you in, where we discuss lots of sad, geeky NEC stuff like we're going to talk about today.
Don't know about sad, Glenn. Don't know about sad. Geeky, definitely. So what we're going to cover today, folks, not in any particular order, but yeah, we're going to be trying to define what it is, weather risk in the NEC, obviously talking about some of the major challenges and the gaps, a little elephant in the room around climate change, and then of course a little bit about, some of the new solutions, things that can be done to kind of try to counteract that. And hopefully there will be lots of questions, maybe some more practical and maybe some more esoteric, but please do answer your question or ask your questions in the box. I'm going to hand over to Glenn now to give us a bit of an intro.
Excellent. And because if we're sharing your screen, I just might need you to click on occasionally, Josh, so I'll say move on or whatever, but it should be fairly obvious. So first of all, we thought we'd just look at what does the contract say about weather. And obviously, if you're going to claim for weather, that will be through the compensation event process, because that's all we can claim for as additional within the contract. So compensation events are matters that occur that are not the contractor's risk under the contract, and you didn't need to have allowed for within your tender price. For it to be a compensation event, it has to be a valid reason under the contract. So you've got to prove there's a big list of 60.1 as to what is a compensation event, and it's got to comply with something on that list to be one. And every time we got a compensation event, not only do we need to consider the cost element, but we also need to consider the time element, because you can't look at one without the other. So any compensation event needs to consider both cost and time in each and every eventuality. Okay, we can move on. So here's our life cycle of a simple compensation event. So each compensation event is going to go through notification, quotation, assessment, and then finally implementation. And it's got to go through that life cycle to get it concluded. So in particular, well, I guess we need to think about the whole life cycle when it comes to weather. But the first thing is it a compensation event? So that's the first thing we need to look at. And once we have agreed it is one, okay, we've got to go through the quotation process and then the assessment before finally it's agreed. So like any compensation event, we've got to get agreement of the time and the cost elements. Thanks, Josh. Here's an example of some of the more common compensation events. This will be familiar. I'm not going to read all of this list out to you, but I've just cherry picked a few compensation events. So some of the more common ones: number 1 is an instruction change in the scope. Number 2 is not getting access to the site. Number 6 is they don't reply to communication within the timescale, right up to number 21, which is additional items stated in contract data part 1. But today's topic is weather. So if you click on one more, Josh, let's have a look at 2 compensation events that are going to be relevant for today. The first one, and the most obvious one, is, well, frankly, the weather clause. It's 60.113. So it says this would be a weather measurement. A weather measurement is recorded within a calendar month before the completion date for the whole of the works and at the place stated in contract data, the value of which, by comparison with the weather data, is shown to occur on average less frequently than once in 10 years. So that's what it's saying. It's got to fit that criteria for it to be a compensation event, and it is done relatively crudely in NEC by per calendar month. I think Josh later will talk about what if it spans a couple of months. Josh will consider that a bit later on. And only the difference between the weather measurement and the weather, which the weather data shows to occur on an average less frequently than 1 in 10 years, is taken into account when you're assessing a compensation event. So if a 1 in 10-year event for snow is 3 days and it snows for 5 days, it's a compensation event, but 2 days, not the full 5 days. So that's the obvious compensation event for weather. The only other one, Josh, if you click on one, there's another one that might be relevant, and this is the equivalent to a force majeure type event. This is an event which stops the contractor completing the works, or stops the contractor completing the works by the date shown on the accepted program, and which neither party could prevent, and an experienced contractor would have judged at the contract date to have such a small chance of occurring, it would have been unreasonable for them to have allowed for it, and is not one of the other compensation events stated in this contract. So possible, and I only say possible, considerations if you've got things like hurricane, tornadoes, or major flooding. So weather obviously would cause flooding, but the weather could be 100 miles away in the hills, and it's okay on your location, and it comes and floods the site. So it's not a weather compensation event, but it may or may not fit a number 19 for it being a compensation event. So they're the two elements really in terms of the compensation event list that could be relevant when we're considering weather. If you click on again, Josh. So in contract data, we've got section 6, and this is the entry elements in contract data part 1. So it says the place where the weather should be recorded is, and all of these are client elements that they're going to fill in, and this will be populated when you receive the contract documents to price as a contractor. These elements will all be filled in. So first of all, the place where the weather is to be recorded. So there's a blank box there. And then it talks about the weather measurements to be recorded for each calendar month are, and then we've got the cumulative rainfall, the number of days of rain more than 5 millimeters, the number of days of rain with minimum air temperatures less than 0 degrees, and the number of days with snow lying at, and then we pick a time during the day. It could be 1100 hours, 1400 hours. So is there the number of days of snow lying on the ground at that particular time? It then says, and these measurements, I'll come back to that in a second. It then says the weather measurements are supplied by. So that could be the Met Office, or it could be another company to provide that weather data. The weather data are the records of past weather measurements for each calendar month, which were recorded at, and then it will say at a location, and which are available from, and it will say who is going to provide those data entries. If you click on one, Josh, I think we're going to fill that box. So I'm just talking about anything not covered as standard. We go in this box. So for example, wind speed is not a standard weather measurement. So unless it's added in, that will not be a 1 in 10-year event. So the only standard ones are rain, snow, and freezing temperatures. So wind speeds, hot temperatures, not normally a problem in the UK, is it? But you remember about 2 or 3 years ago, we had that space of a week or two where it was 40 degrees every day. That was affecting a lot of surfacing works and things like that. So, but it wasn't a compensation event, because in this country, we don't even see that yellow thing in the sky surrounded by blue normally. So hot temperatures is not normally so much of a problem. Things like frost and fog. I do a fair bit at the airports, and obviously that causes massive problems, disruption as well. So those are types of weather measurement that are not traditionally picked up within contract data. Thanks, Josh. If we click on, I think we've got one more element of contract data. So where there are no recorded data available, then we've got a blank box. So assumed weather. So the client will then determine where the assumed weather might be. If you're working up in the Highlands of Scotland, there's quite a few weather stations in more densely populated in areas of England, but in Scotland, it's perfectly conceivable that there might not be a weather station near you for several miles if you're out in the sort of Highlands. So either we're going to pick a weather station that's several miles away, which won't probably be representative, or assumed data could be put into contract data. Click on again. Just another little point, everything we've covered so far is in this book, the engineering construction contract between the client and the contractor, and similarly in the subcontract as well. So that contract data entry is in both of those. In the short contracts, which are more condensed, whatever you think of it in the ECC, it's even simpler and even more subjective potentially in the short contract. So you can read it there. So in the short contract, it says the contractor is prevented by weather from carrying out all work on the site for periods of time, each at least 1 full day working day, and which are in total more than 1/7 of the total number of days between the starting date and the completion date. So you've got to be stopped for weather for the whole day, not 8/10 of the day, the whole day, and the number of whole days you've been stopped has to be more than 1/7 of the total number of days on the project. Now, I don't think we're here particularly to judge, okay, is that right, fair or not? But like many things in the short contract, it simplifies it. And that is the simple element, the process they built in to the short contracts for considering weather. So if we click on again, Josh, we've got a couple more elements to consider. So Josh is going to get into much more detail, but just from an NEC perspective, so where the weather data values come from, commonly has been taken from Met Office reports historically. Up until I did a Seeker bulletin, some of you might have seen it earlier this year, or December it was. And up until this year, the Met Office data was a statistical analysis, not an average of the last 10 years, but a statistical analysis between 1971 and 2010. So therefore, the weather data was 14 years out of date. It's only now, literally in the last couple of months, and in speaking to the Met Office, in writing that report, they have updated their weather data up until 2020. So you've now got another 10 years of data adding to the weather data. But just because you're adding another 10 years of data doesn't mean, so if it snowed for 20 days every day for the last 10 years, if it didn't snow for the previous 50 years, then it doesn't mean that it now becomes 10, 20 days. It will increase it, but only by a small proportion, because although it's statistically happening more frequently now, it's done over a lot longer statistical analysis. Easy word to say. So yeah, that's how currently it is being done. So that's partly what we're looking at today. Is that right? Is it fair? Is there a better system? But at the moment, we need to look at what the rules are and how the current data is recorded. Just click on, Josh. I think I've got one or two more maybe. So proving weather is a compensation event. That's the easy bit. So relatively straightforward and should not really be in any way subjective as to whether data is or is not above a 1 in 10 year event threshold. If you click on one more, we then find the tricky bit is assessing the impact for the weather delay. So a 1 in 10 year event of snow in December is 3 days. If there's proven to be snow on the ground for 6 days, the contractor has to prove the impact of the extra over effect of the additional 3 days. And then there's further subjectivity, because who's a scientist to now tell us what the classification of snow is, and at what point does snow become slush or ice, and what percentage of the site needs to be covered in snow. So what seemed like a fairly straightforward rule isn't necessarily actually a straightforward rule. Just click on again, Josh. I can't remember if that's me or not. Okay, so that's setting the scene in terms of what the NEC contract is talking about. Okay, Josh, so what do you reckon about the weather data, where we're getting it from, and are we a bit out of date, do you think, with the way historically we've done it?
It's a pretty interesting question, Glenn, and I'll cover this slide, and then I wanted to just go back and ask you a couple of questions, because I think
Sure.
your lead-in worked really well there. Particularly just thinking about the fact that the Met Office only recently updated their data to 2020. So this top statistic here about the fact that in 2020, about 45% of projects suffered delay due to weather, and that was a global statistic. There has been some research done in Europe and UK, which is saying that in 2024, 93% of construction managers are saying they're facing weather-related challenges and delays in the past year. So I think, and the data that we're looking at ourselves at EHAB shows as well, you really can quite have big rapid changes even in 4 years. So I know the whole concept around climate change is something that's slow and long and happens over time. But I think weather is because of the severity of variability in weather, you really can see quite rapid changes. And that statistic along the bottom there, the kind of extreme delays that might come from, as you mentioned, maybe a flood or something quite severe, they're on the rise. So I think we're facing an environment where actually the underlying data is really important. Know why or what data is being chosen, then you could be signing up for risk that you weren't really aware of. But I just wanted to jump back, Glenn, because I think I'm really curious. You obviously get to see quite a lot of NEC contracts and things that are happening in that world. So I'm wondering if you think that any of the original weather clause assumptions that have been made in the contract actually are still relevant today, given the volatility that I think it's pretty clear that we're seeing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's a very difficult topic, and I think NEC has tried to take a relatively simple approach. I mean, the short contract is really simple. That's pretty crude way of doing it. But then in a short contract, we're just trying to keep it sort of simple. So it is quite crude, you know, in a calendar month. So I think you're going to cover it. We could span whether either side of a month, at the end of one month, beginning of the next month, and you're not entitled to it. Whereas if it happened 2 weeks earlier, it's all in 1 month, you're entitled to it. So that's quite crude. The weather data, I think at least we've covered it. So we've got opportunity to add extra weather measurements in. Wind is the obvious one. You know, Richard, I'm glad Richard's picking me up on italics and things like that. That's all he's got to say in the chat. But he makes some other good points, more important points as well, in terms of gusts. So yeah, not only use wind speed, you'd have to think about for wind speed above 50 miles an hour, or maybe that's a bit much, above 30 miles an hour for longer than 10 minutes, because otherwise, oh, we have one gust. There we go. Richard can claim for it. Whereas it needs to be a bit more prolonged than that. So there's all sorts of these criteria that we need to think about. And maybe off the back of this, maybe there's a more comprehensive weather guide. We as individuals or as a group, maybe you could put together. I don't know. Hadn't thought about that before today's session.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my sort of second follow on to this is, and you've mentioned and touched upon how difficult it can ultimately start to become when you're trying to prove that kind of impact above and beyond what you had agreed. And so I think I'm just curious, once you get into this kind of murky debate around, well, is it snow or is it slush? How have you, what it really is the hardest part for people is because it's clearly not the data like you mentioned. So I'm just wondering if you could add any more flavor into that piece around actually proving it and why that's so difficult.
Well, I think in actual fact, once you've agreed it's a compensation event, like any compensation event, the difficulty is then proving the actual impact, because you know a 2-3 days of snow might mean you miss a booked closure, and then the next book closure isn't for 2 months. So 3 days of snow could have a 60-day delay. And like anything, a client will not be wanting to pay or agree for any increase to the prices and any increase to completion date if they don't have to. So yeah, there's one aspect about the weather elements, and there's another aspect about proving the actual impact on the program that it's had, and then reflecting that in terms of cost and time. But that's true of any compensation event, really. It just so happens we're talking about one here but if it was due to lack of access, you could say exactly the same thing. So yeah, that's a more generic issue, and it just so happens that the ones we're talking about here are prompted by weather.
Got you. Okay. No, thank you, Glenn. Well, listen, are there any questions that we want to address in the chat right now? I'm not looking at the chat right now.
I think we'll push on, and we can go back, and time permitting, we can then reflect. I'll have a look at a couple of them, maybe answer some of them, but yeah, we'll go through them as we towards the end.
Makes sense. Well, thank you again, Glenn. I'm now gonna kind of draw on some of the learnings that we've been having, where we've been getting, you know, as EHAB, really into the weeds around weather specifically. And what I've tried to do is break down some of the gaps maybe that we've seen in that specific weather clause that Glenn's just introduced. And I think what I'm breaking it down into is these 3 buckets. So there's the data, there's the actual structure of the clause itself, and then there's the kind of the process of how you then put those things together and actually move forward with your compensation event. And I think, like I just mentioned earlier, it's pretty important to know what these gaps are, so that you know what you're, you know, in the event that you are still signing up to the standard basic structure that is the default, you know, so that you know what you potentially are facing when you're signing up to that in the contract. I think is pretty important. So Glenn already mentioned, and I'm going to kind of go into detail on a couple of these as well in a little moment, but weather stations. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the map of all of the weather stations that the Met Office provides. When you're really zoomed out from the UK, it looks very, very detailed, and like there's stations every single, you know, everywhere. but actually the gaps can be pretty large. And actually we worked on a project where we had an actual weather station at a site, and then there was a Met Office station about 1.5 miles away. And it was a compensation event according to the site data set, the weather station we had at the site from rainfall, but it was not according to the weather station which the Met Office had recorded. And as far as we could tell, ultimately, the stations was pretty similar in spec. It was just purely the fact that the rain had not quite gotten all the way to that location. And so even small distances, I guess is the point I'm trying to make, can result in potentially significant, compensation event triggering events being different from one location to another. So that's one thing to really think about around the data. The defaults you already mentioned as well there, Glenn. So wind speed is pretty obvious one, and gusts as well. So I think from a data perspective, ensuring that let's just call them the weather types that you are going to be signed up to. If you're in a particularly windy location, or if you're doing crane lifting, which many jobs are, then maybe you want to try to include wind in there. And maybe you want to try to include average wind speed and gust speed as well, because there may well be different impacts that come from those things. We've already touched on, and please, Glenn, feel free to jump in if you want to on any of these points. But I will ask you at the end of this slide if you think it's fair or flawed. But the reliance on the Met Office. So yeah, again, I'm going to touch on it in a second. But the data is up until 2020, and I hope that I've kind of ruffled your feathers a little bit where I've showed that in 2020 it was 45% of projects are delayed, and now in 2024 about 93% of managers are reporting weather delays. So clearly up to 2020 may not still be the appropriate time frame for that data to be relevant, and often people are just getting the PDF reports in arrears. There may not be anything kind of to forecast to kind of indicate that you're approaching your limits. And the final piece there is climate lock-in. So again, depending on how long your project is, it may well be much longer than potentially the project is locking in something where it may actually be more favorable for contractors, and maybe clients are overpaying, and really depending on how much data you decide to pick and at what location and where. Because again, we've been looking at a lot of data and seeing that there are really a lot of variables that kind of make up this, and maybe the simplification is good, but I don't know that people are aware of what they're signing up to, I think is the point that I'm trying to make. So Glenn, on this topic of data specifically, do you think within the NEC it's fair, or is it flawed?
I'll say flawed, but depending on what we talk about today, so I think it is flawed, but whether it's flawed enough that we need something different remains to be seen. So there's certainly room for more precise, more accurate elements, but then they bring other problems with it, and the balance is, okay, which one's going to be right? So yes, flawed. Do we need something better? Maybe.
Fair enough.
Maybe not.
Fair enough. Good answer. Okay. So the second piece was around the structure. So again, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but the measurement period, I think, is a really, really fascinating one. And I don't actually have a simple, easy solution for this one, because as you perhaps just alluded to, whatever the mechanism, there's always going to be some element of, you have to kind of pick something. And just because, clearly weather is a chaotic system, that's in its nature. It's not going to align neatly. So obviously in the contract, as you mentioned, it's calendar months. So you're going to be recording the month of January, the month of February. But your activities that are going to be impacted and the weather events themselves are clearly not going to fit neatly in those calendar boundaries. So I personally have seen a rain event that happened over the 2 months boundaries, and ultimately it meant that the amount of rainfall that fell kind of got halved, and in neither case it ultimately led to a compensation event because there just wasn't enough rainfall for each of those months, but actually the event itself was pretty impactful. So clearly, obviously that doesn't happen all the time, But in the case that it does happen, then that doesn't seem like the best way to measure that event. And I think the other one, which is pretty interesting, I don't know how many people have thought about this, although some folks who are our customers are on the call as well, but the thresholds that have been chosen, and that Glenn, you showed us earlier, for example, number of days with rainfall over 5 millimeters. That ultimately seems arbitrary, because of course it may be that an activity is not at all affected by 5 millimeters of rain, or it may be that that's way above the threshold at which an activity is impacted. And I think, of course, they've tried to choose something which seems fair and seems simple, but actually in actual fact, once you start to get down to the nuts and bolts of, well, how do you then actually calculate the impact? Because you're dealing with one set of thresholds and you're actually measuring them against effectively a different set of thresholds, the thresholds at which an activity is impacted, you have to do quite a lot of figuring out and calculation to really ultimately get to what I would maybe call an apples to apples scenario. Whereas at the moment, because of the way the thresholds are structured, it's kind of apples to oranges, and that's very difficult in justifying that. So, Glenn, you know what's coming. Do you think it's fair or flawed?
Well, I can split this one, because the second one I think is probably okay, because you are right. Well, it did rain. We did have a 1 in 10-year event for rain, but hang on, there's a roof on, so they weren't affected. Well, if it's a CE, but it doesn't impact the works, then there's nothing to claim. So that bit of it isn't a problem. I do agree with the first one, though. The first one is flawed, because I've experienced it numerous times myself over the years as a contractor, where, yeah, we've had snow or rain, the end of the month, beginning of the next month, cause big problems. Neither individual month was actually enough to trigger an event. But so yes, flawed. What's the alternative? Well, that could be even trickier. And I'm because you've now got 1 in 10-year events for January and February, but what about the mid-Jan to the end to the middle of Feb? That now becomes a whole bigger problem. So flawed, I'm not sure there's an easy solution, but I'll just leave it as not sure. And we're going to explore as a group maybe whether there is a better solution to that.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I'll fight you on the arbitrary thresholds one, but we'll get there. So next one, the process, and I think that you've already mentioned the really big problem is the burden of proof, and I think this is linked to the arbitrary thresholds point. But when you are ultimately as a contractor, you have to first and foremost, of course, know that it's been the comp event. Okay, so you get the report from the Met Office. You have some data that that was stated in your contract, and you now know, okay, great, this is a comp event. Clearly, you then need to figure out, well, what is just the difference above? And again, that's pretty simple. But how do you then model and truly understand what the impact of that event is, and how does that flow down the chain? So I think there's quite a lot of difficulty there. And the reason I think it is tied to the arbitrary thresholds is because if you want to model the amount of risk that you've put in there based on, let's just use that number of days with rain over 5 mil, that's one thing that you've needed to kind of understand what the impact of that is. And then you have to say, well, okay, each additional day above 5 millimeters, and what is the actual impact of that? Well, it may be that it was only the days where it then was 10 millimeters of rain where it actually had the impact. So you kind of start to, I suppose, get into a bit of a quagmire, at least around, okay, well, which number am I using to actually define the impact on the schedule itself? And I think that can just be quite tricky to do, and potentially, if the claim isn't big enough, then it may not be worth your time. So I've definitely spoken to contractors where if it's too small of an event or too small of a claim, then of course that the burden of proof is too high, and it basically doesn't make sense for them to do that. Of course, that's up to them. And you touched on it a second ago, Glenn, actually around, of course, in this process, everyone is trying to get the best opportunity for themselves, and because of the subjective nature, I think it then gives room and space for the parties to maximize or minimize the claim, whatever is in their best interest to do. So again, I don't necessarily have a solution for that part of it. But on these 2 points, from a process perspective, Glenn, fair or flawed?
I'm probably more leaning towards fair, only in the sense of it is flawed, but it's flawed for everything in terms of how you're going to demonstrate the impact of any compensation event, the direct impact. Because, like you said, you've got an extra 3 millimeters of rain. How does that equate to this activity being delayed by exactly half a day, which has had this impact? So yeah, it's difficult, but it's difficult for any compensation event, and any compensation event is going to be subjective, because you've also got, well, the fact you've also got forecast risk and things like that. There's another issue. Compensation events are based on forecast, and as we all know, weather forecasts are not normally accurate. So future forecasts for anything, that adds another spin into the mix there. So yeah, there is a problem. There is elements that are difficult to definitively define, but I'm not sure what the alternative is. So on that, for that reason, I wouldn't say it's necessarily flawed. That's just a problem we've got with any compensation event.
Got it. Okay, good answer. So I think on, and this actually seems like we're aligned to some extent, Glenn, is that data is definitely outdated, and I think that's probably the simplest one to fix as well, isn't it? Where depending on where you're choosing to have your data from, depending on what years that you want to calculate your 1 in 10, that actually can result in quite a lot of difference. If you're picking data that stops in 2010 versus 2020 versus 2025, that simple decision actually can result in a fair amount of difference. Maybe not huge amounts, but so data is outdated. And I think that structure, yeah, you mentioned one of the points being flawed, the other one fairly fair. So I think there are problems that can come from that, and I think I have some potentially simple solutions, but whether people would sign up to that isn't obviously another issue. And I think, in my view, those kind of two things ultimately end up compounding. So the data and the structure, which makes the process piece of it harder than it maybe necessarily needs to be. And because of that, it ends a bit reactive and probably not. Again, I'm not the NEC expert in the room, Glenn, but not in the spirit of the contract around collaboration and kind of joint effort and risk sharing. So that's my view. Is it fit for purpose in 2025? Maybe we need to think about it. Maybe there's a weather guide, like you said. Maybe there's just more thought that needs to go into the structure around this. And I just wanted to quickly run through slightly deeper on a couple of these examples. So if you've seen this report before, then this is the kind of the standard Met Office report that is just the one that you can get from their website as a summary. But if you notice on this particular report, and perhaps if you're buying them nowadays, it says 2020. But yeah, you might be getting long-term averages and 1 in 10 values. It's worth understanding what the dates are that the data is being provided. As Glenn mentioned, if you're just adding an additional 10 years, that isn't necessarily changing the goalpost. If you're shifting, 1981 to 2020, then that's going to have a different impact as to whether you're also including 1971. And this location, I believe, is very close to the Met Office head office, but it actually isn't quite at the head office for the Met Office. So even they have about 1.3 mile difference between where the station is located and their offices are located, which the anecdote I shared earlier, 1.3 miles can be enough to knock a compensation event one way or the other. So it is worth bearing that in mind. And I think 1.3 miles is quite a small distance. I know people have had stations quite a lot further away from the site than that.
You would have thought they'd put one on their roof, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you would have thought.
You would have thought, just for that reason, let's have one right on the roof.
Why don't you message them about that, Glenn, and see what they say? But as Glenn mentioned, the data is up to date to 2020. So they have at least much better than it was. Let's put it that way. And this one I think is obvious. You know, we've already talked about this, but this is just specifically saying, well, what if you have a 1 in 10 sized event that happens on either side of the calendar month? I think everyone maybe understands that now. So that's just what I was referring to, and I think what Glenn's referring to as well around the actual measurement period. Of course, that could result in just as much of a delay. So it's irrelevant whether it was in a calendar month or not. And there's an interesting one here that I think is very, very climate focused, because, yeah, of course, hot temperatures are going to potentially result in certain amounts of impact. But I think there's then, how does that heat wave change the baseline of risk that is occurring at your location? So maybe you've had a few days of lost productivity because you have to have people, you know, sitting in the shade, having more breaks, drinking more water. Potentially you're not working outside when it's above 35 degrees, potentially. But what that actually does to the ground is quite interesting. So if you have a heat wave, of course, everyone sees it, your lawn goes brown, or, you know, the ground, everyone can feel it, is just harder. And what if you then do suddenly have a rainfall event that is not a 1 in 10 rainfall event, but it's just a, you know, it's just a heavy amount of rainfall, which if you've you know, post a heat wave, often there are thunderstorms that occur. The ground is now much less effective at absorbing the water, and so you might have these, and the research kind of shows that this is happening more frequently because of climate-induced heat waves. You have a flash flood event that, you know, would not have happened in that location normally, because the ground, you know, normally would just absorb that amount of rainfall that you would have in that area. So it's maybe these combinations of things where it's not just the days lost from the heat wave, but it was actually then what's the knock-on effect of that. And I don't have an answer. I'm just, you know, basically pointing out that these types of events are becoming more common, particularly in the Mediterranean basin, but yeah, for sure everywhere in Europe, these types of events are becoming more frequent. So yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't know if Glenn, you'd thought about that one before, but how would that be handled?
Yeah, not specifically, but you can see easily. Yeah, and that's not going to be picked up at all.
Yeah. And so, my final place that I'm going to kind of talk about the thresholds themselves. So within the EHAB platform, we have 150 standard thresholds that are associated actually to how weather impacts the actual activities that are being done on site. And so this is maybe my point around the arbitrary thresholds, where if you actually look at the crossover of the NEC thresholds versus what actually impacts thresholds, they aren't that similar. And so if you're trying to model basically your risk under an NEC contract, it becomes quite difficult to basically do that, because you're kind of comparing things that are slightly separate. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the stuff that we're working on at EHAB to try to solve these problems. Definitely not going to solve all of them, but I think ultimately what we're trying to get to is having more certainty in all of these things. So accurate data is something that we really think we can solve. Trying to bring something slightly more flexible to the structure. Again, there's still lots of assumptions that have to be made, and then an automated process, so that if there is work that has to be done, then for the most part it can be taken care of by something that's going to reduce the cost of doing that. So hopefully that people can get compensated fairly. So within the EHAB system, we actually get now 80 years of historic data. There are 80 different weather types, so including fog, including solar radiation, you know, all sorts of different things. It's at about a 5 kilometer, 3 mile grid globally. And the way that we process all that data is there's about 60 different satellite sources, lots of weather stations, and actually also weather balloons that get factored in. And climate patterns are included by default. So we wouldn't be looking at a simple average of the 80 years of historic data. In essence, we would factor in the trends that are occurring in each of those locations into that data set. And that forward-looking model is something that, you know, I think is really, really needed if you are trying to actually model risk at the beginning of your project. We then have a system where we look at each of the categories, and so this is going back to the 150 standard categories. So there's categories for earthworks, for lifting, for concrete, and of course each of them are affected differently. So maybe it is 5 millimeters of rain that affects earthworks, and maybe it's a completely different number for lifting and concrete in terms of rainfall. And then there is of course going to be different things. So lifting is going to be affected by lightning strikes, whereas, you know, other items may not be. So the way in the system that we actually look at this is by looking at each of your activities in P6 and using existing activity codes or even UDF fields to basically map this to a model in the EHAB platform, and then we can run an analysis based on the thresholds that have actually been provided and that weather data that I just mentioned. You know, the kind of the best in class data set there. And then from an NEC perspective, we have an automated monthly report, which basically will look at the thresholds in the NEC, and it will basically state, you know, are you above or below your threshold? So was it a compensation event or not? We also have we tried to replicate the Met Office report to some extent, but we have a column which is not in the Met Office report, which is it's kind of the anomaly threshold. So how above or below normal was this? So that you can maybe just use that as additional evidence when you're trying to understand the shape of a claim. And we have a new module actually coming out which automatically looks at the schedule. And if you upload your baseline versus the latest schedule, then you can automatically calculate what the effect and impact of the event was. So if there was a compensation event, if there was monthly rainfall above the 1 in 10 value, then we will look at the difference of that and understand what the implication of that is down the dependency chain of your program. So I think we've created a solution which, for the most part, will automate at least the analysis piece. Of course, there's still then the taking that to your client and talking them through and proving or having that discussion. But I think the gathering of the data, the structuring of the way that you can analyze it in our platform, that's all done automatically now. So, you know, very happy to go through that with anyone if they're interested. I see we're running out of time. We've been, I do want time for questions. So old versus new, I'm just going to very quickly flick through this. Hopefully, if you use EHAB data, then it solves most of these problems that we mentioned before around weather stations, around some of the kind of the climate lock-in, because we're trying to factor all that information in. Around the measurement period, that's probably a difficult one. But in our system, you can customize the way in which the automated report gets generated. So this may not make sense, but you could have a rolling 30-day period in theory if you wanted to understand if the previous 30 days on a rolling basis was kind of an extreme event. That would capture the fact of not having a kind of a calendar split of the weather days, but then how would you actually pick when to actually make a compensation event? So it doesn't really solve the problem necessarily, but it is an interesting maybe thought process. The burden of proof, I think in the EHAB system, we're really trying to automate it as much as possible, and making sure that, you know, the risk is actually accounted for. So because we model forward, like you were talking about, Glenn, how do you do a forward-looking forecast accurately? And in the EHAB system, we're about 94% accurate at modeling weather impact, even multiple years into the future. So, you know, we do that because through that whole system that I just described, with the kind of very long data time series. So on the EHAB side, we're really trying to achieve more alignment and clarity and less ambiguity. Definitely, we aren't solving all of those problems, but I think it's definitely something where if we can have more certainty, then that ultimately leads to better project outcomes. But I will just mention we're already operational on about 185 sites since 2020, a very long time now. We work with some really fantastic companies who we're really proud and happy to be working with. And I know, Glenn, I'll just flip to your slide. So if anyone wants to get phenomenal resources from Glenn and GMH Planning, then on the screen here is where you can get that, Glenn.
Yep, so we've our GMH Planning website, gmhplanning.co.uk. We've got lots of free downloads, guidance notes on this subject matter and lots of others. So we do a monthly bulletin in conjunction with SECA, the Civil Engineering Contractors Associations. You can find it there. And also some of the discussions we've had, and we're going to have a few more minutes of now, we've got in our LinkedIn group. So within our LinkedIn group, we've got NEC specific discussions that go on. So any aspects we've covered today and other NEC topics we can discuss, and lots of experts in there chewing the fat over elements. Do we need to revise the contract? Is it right? And that's what we do regularly within the LinkedIn group. So.
Right, we've got 10 minutes. So hopefully, and if anyone wants to email me, my email's in the bottom left there. But I'll stop sharing my screen now, and would love to. Yeah, maybe we've got some. I've not looked at any of the questions, Glenn. So maybe is there one in particular that you think would be a good place to start?
Yeah, I've got one, Josh. So if your weather data is so accurate, my golf day is on the 9th of September at Westerham. Is it going to rain?
I can give you a percentage of how likely it is to rain.
Okay. Well, anyone who's been on my golf days would tell you it always blooming rains, whichever day I choose. So yeah, it may or may not skew your data. So we'll see.
I'll happily talk to you about that afterwards, Glenn.
So yeah, maybe I'll consult at least the average there. Yeah, well, I've been chatting and obviously listening. So yeah, I don't know if anyone's got a particular issue. Sean O'Connell talked about a common issue that we encounter is evaluating the CE once it's been agreed as a CE. Is the effect of the CE limited to the period after the 1 in 10 year threshold has passed, generally later in the month, or an average throughout the month? Well, it's not definitive. So again, it just comes down to, first of all, it's got to pass the first test. Is it in excess of the 1 in 10? Because if it doesn't pass that, then it's not a CE, and almost doesn't matter whether you're trying to justify the entitlement, because it's not recoverable as a CE. I mean, you should see what impact it's had because you've got to revise your program, but it will not be due to a CE, so it'll be your liability. And it could be that the 1 in 10, above the 1 in 10, it's like, well, those extra days then occurred on weekends and we're not working weekends, so the impact is actually nothing. So yeah, it's a good question, and it's not definitive within the contract potentially, so we're left with then sort of unpicking what is the right answer then. But yeah, it is looking at, you've got to achieve the threshold, and then once you exceed it, it's the extra over is how you should be assessing that compensation. So you don't average it back through the month. It's then what impact has that specifically had, but that's not straightforward. And I think that is the problem. Whilst we can say, yeah, the NEC solution, well, it's a bit primitive, or it's a bit this, it's a bit that, but we do have to be careful, because if we don't have that, okay, what's the alternative? And the alternative will come with benefits, and it will come with other issues. And it's on balance, what is it best to do? One thing I was thinking, Josh, I mean, there's two elements here. So with your data, one, it's going to help contractors justify their entitlement. But secondly, it's going to help clients in the first place decide what the 1 in 10 year thresholds are. Now, I think the good news for you is if the client can up the 1 in 10 year thresholds by real data, then it means the contractor's got to know that that is their data, and they've got to allow for up that level of risk, and beyond that would be then recoverable as a compensation event. So I think the good news for you providing the data is that the client will be interested in getting more accurate data, because the more accurate it is, the less likely the contractor is to exceed the 1 in 10, and the less likely they'll have to pay out as a compensation event.
Yeah, and I think this is, I keep coming back to this arbitrary thresholds point, Glenn, which is if you model and create your schedule from the very beginning with the same data set through which the contract is being created, and that's what both parties are seeing and signing up to, I think that just gives the best starting point for all discussions around okay, what mitigations are going to be made? How are we going to best manage this risk together? Because I think it's when you start to kind of have people looking at different data sources, and those can be very different in again, almost in a completely, you don't think, why would the historic data be different for different vendors? But it fundamentally can be massively different because of the way in which people look back and calculate and assign different things. And so you're introducing uncertainty there, which is entirely a third party kind of debate and discussion. Whereas if you just kind of bring it all together, that can still be the Met Office, right? If you somehow use the Met Office's data to forecast your risk, then maybe that's the best approach as well. But I think it's just being on the same data set is pretty important.
Yeah, it strikes me that this webinar is the start of our global discussions, because I think that yeah, there's a lot to come from this in terms of what do we change and what do we change it to. I think we should let Richard, very politely, he's got his hand up. So Richard, I don't know if you can unmute, but
I think I can allow the mic and I'll allow the video.
Yeah, I think you should limit Richard Patterson to 60 seconds on the microphone, but a worthy 60 seconds.
Harsh, Glenn, harsh. Two very simple questions I've put in the chat. One is, I think it's wrong that the NEC contract data does not state the duration of the weather data. In other words, how far do we go back? So apparently recently the Met Office just suddenly on their own have continued and said, oh, let's update the weather for another 5 years. That has changed the risk allocation for contracts that were signed up prior to that change. That can't be right. So I think the NEC contract needs to state how far the weather data should go back. And the other simple thing I put in the chat was, I think we should be encouraging all clients to buy the bloody 1 in 10 year data and include it within the tender documents. Wouldn't that be a nice idea? Over.
Absolutely, definitely on that one, Richard. I mean, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? Why are 5 tenderers have to go and buy the weather data where the client can include it in one? And up until, well, they only had to, it's when it's 14 years out of date, you didn't even have to buy another one. So you know, you buy it, it would last for ages. All right, we've got to buy a new report now because they've updated another 10 years worth of data. But yeah, wouldn't that be wonderfully simplistic and sensible?
I'm just looking through the questions here. We've got 3 minutes left. Is there anything else that stood out to you, Glenn? I mean, there's loads of stuff in the chat here that I've not read, so apologies.
And we'll try and pick up on this. So we will go back, and it's hard when we're chatting, and obviously there's 100 people on the call nearly. So yeah, difficult to answer everyone's, but we'll go back. I mean, has anyone got an absolute burning point or a question? We will go back and look through the chat and you know, cover some of these points in either documents or we'll put it in the LinkedIn group. But anyone got a burning question? You raise your hand if you just want to repeat something you put in chat, or you've got something you want to share. And I think we'll spend a bit of time going through the comments that we've got here. Steve Pierce, welcome, Steve.
Let me unmute you, sir. All right. You're free to go, Steve.
He's still on mute, by the way.
Yourself.
He's muted himself, which is a rare thing for Mr. Pierce.
Thank you very much, Glenn. You can hear me, Josh, yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Steve.
So the point I was trying to make in the chat there was that, you know, it's almost a no-brainer that we should adopt better data, better locations, more accurate ones, but more often than not, it's in the contract data, it's the default, it goes through. 6 months later on, we think, oh, we really should have changed that. This isn't relevant, or it doesn't work for us, and then we're stuck with it. So it's the timing of getting that right. And as you say, you might be able to select the clients actually reducing their exposure to CEs by having, but somehow we need to get that in the early loop that it's better for all of us and is more certainty than we know what we're bidding on, rather than this, oh, we're stuck with very old data, but we didn't really read that clause. Which is what tends to happen, I think, until we hit something, then we think, oh, it doesn't really suit us, or the data's not, you know, we didn't think of that when we did our risk pot.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. I think you're right, and it will bring it. potentially it could increase the tender prices, because we're going to be realizing actually, because less is going to be a compensation event, then the contractor's got more risk, and obviously more risk will be reflected in tender prices. So it will lead to more cost certainty, which has got to be good for everyone. And yeah, less compensation events if the data's more accurate. But potentially contractors realizing, hang on, I hadn't really thought about that before. We have got more risk than we ever considered, and we need to obviously make sure we allow for that within our tender prices. But hey, I think cost certainty has got a lot to, there's a lot of benefit in having cost certainty rather than having numerous CEs that are difficult, subjective potentially to get agreement on. So.
Well, folks, we've reached the end, and I really, really appreciate all the comments in the chat. Really appreciate you taking the time. Like Glenn said, we'll follow up with the video recording. And if you aren't already part of the NEC NEC People LinkedIn group, then jump on there, because I'll be posting on there and we can continue the discussion. So thanks very, very much for your time. Glenn, do you want any final words?
No, just good. As I've got more thoughts in my head than answers now. So like every day is a school day, we always say this, and just having some of these chats and some of the questions in the chat. Yeah, I think what we do agree, I think it needs to change. And what to? Well, that's what we all need to work on. And I think we need to do this as a group. So we've got to reflect on what would be beneficial for the industry as a whole and how we're going to do it. So yeah, interesting times, I think, coming forward.
Yeah, and final thoughts from me, folks, is if you want to reach out, and we're one vendor. We are trying to make things more certain, more fair in the face of climate change. So if you think that that would be useful for you and your projects, then just drop me a message. I'll be very happy to chat. All right, everyone. Thanks for your time. See you later. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Josh. See you, everyone.